Chantel Briggs had just handed her 10-year-old son a tray of pancakes at their local diner, when a white customer leaned in, looked Malik dead in the eye, and said, "Kids like you don't belong in calculus." That same night, Malik solved a math problem that had stumped Ivy League professors for decades. By morning, his school labeled him a cheater. But what Malik uncovered next would expose a conspiracy buried deep in America's tech elite. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Morning arrived slowly in the small Georgia town where Chantel Briggs lived, moving like a tired sigh across the faded rooftops and cracked sidewalks. The air carried a soft chill, the kind that made everything feel just a little heavier, a little more fragile. Chantel rose quietly, so she wouldn't disturb her son, Malik, whose small bedroom was practically glowing with sheets of scribbled numbers, taped diagrams, and patterns only he understood. The boy slept curled around a notebook, his pencil still between his fingers. Chantel paused in the doorway, watching him breathe with the steady rhythm of a child who didn't yet understand the weight the world had already placed on his shoulders. She whispered into the dimness, "You're gonna change everything someday, baby. Even if they don't want to see it." Her own day was about to begin in the same way it had for years. The uniform, the softening smile, the diner where she served coffee to people who remembered her name, only when they needed something. But she carried herself with the quiet fire of a woman, raising a child she knew was exceptional. Not just bright, not just clever. Exceptional. When Malik woke later that morning, he blinked at the late sunrise breaking through his blinds. His eyes immediately darted to the notebook. "I think I finally figured out the last sequence," he murmured to himself. If the prime numbers wrap differently, the whole pattern shifts. He didn't know many 10-year-olds who thought like that. He didn't actually know any. But he knew that his mother believed in him more than anyone else in the world. Downstairs, Chantel tied her apron as she prepared Malik's breakfast, her movements practiced and efficient. When he walked in, rubbing his eyes, she smiled at him with a warmth so steady it felt like home. "You dream about numbers again?" she asked. "I didn't dream," he answered honestly. "I calculated." She laughed softly. "Of course you did." But even in the lightness of their banter, there was something deeper in her gaze, a flicker of worry she carried like an invisible scar. Chantel knew talent. She also knew how talent became a threat when it lived inside a black child. Later that morning, she dropped him at school. The building always felt colder than the weather outside, as if the walls themselves rejected anything unfamiliar. Teachers offered tight smiles that never reached their eyes. Parents whispered as she walked past, nothing loud, nothing blatant, just enough to remind her she was tolerated, not welcomed. At the diner, Chantel moved between tables with practiced grace. The regulars knew her, yet hardly knew her at all. She poured their coffee, took their orders, absorbed their offhand remarks. A man at table 6 looked her up and down as she handed him his plate. "You've been here a long time, haven't you?" "6 years," she replied politely. "You got a kid, right? Heard you talking the other day." "Yes," she said, steadying her voice. "My son, Malik." He gave a slow, dismissive chuckle. "Well, don't raise your hopes too high. Kids from around here need to stay in their place." The words struck her harder than she expected. She didn't flinch on the outside. She never gave strangers that satisfaction. But inside, something twisted. She had heard worse in her lifetime, and yet this felt sharper, as if it wasn't aimed at her job or her circumstance, but directly at Malik's potential. Chantel leaned in and answered with controlled calm. "My son's place is wherever he chooses to be." The man shrugged and smirked, as if amused by her optimism. He went back to eating his eggs. Chantel walked away before anger could take root, but her hands trembled just slightly. She thought of Malik sitting in a classroom right now, surrounded by people who saw him the same way this customer did. A boy to be boxed in, underestimated, contained. While Chantel pushed through her shift, Malik sat in his math class, staring at a worksheet filled with problems he had solved years ago. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The teacher droned. Malik scribbled patterns on the back of the sheet, seeing relationships no one had taught him, connections that unfolded like hidden maps only he could read. The teacher walked past, saw the back of the paper, and frowned. "Malik, that's not the assignment. We're working on long division today." He looked up. "But I finished that already. We do things as a class," she said, a forced gentleness coating her irritation. "You need to stop wandering off on your own." "But the pattern."
"That's enough," she snapped quietly.
"You're being disruptive again." Malik lowered his gaze. He didn't understand why thinking differently was called misbehavior, why being ahead meant he was off task, why every time he tried to explain something, adults tightened their voices or replaced curiosity with suspicion. At lunch, two boys approached him. One nudged his tray. "You think you're better than everybody, don't you?" Malik shook his head. "I don't think that. You act like it," the other boy muttered. "Teacher said you keep causing problems in class." They walked away before he could explain. Malik's throat tightened. He picked at his food, not hungry anymore. Later that afternoon, Chantel arrived at the school for a parent meeting she didn't know existed until the office called her during her shift. She sat across from the principal and two teachers, all wearing expressions that mimicked concern but carried judgment underneath. "Miss Briggs," the principal began, folding his hands neatly, "we've observed some behaviors that suggest Malik may require specialized support." Chantel's eyebrows lifted. "Specialized how?" "We're considering evaluating him for potential learning difficulties," a teacher added. "He seems distracted, unable to stay with the class, often rewriting problems in ways that make no sense." Chantel held her breath. "Did he get any of them wrong?" "Well, no," the teacher said reluctantly. "But that isn't the point. He refuses to follow the method." "He refuses," Chantel repeated. "Or he understands beyond it." The principal forced a sympathetic look. "We're not questioning his ability. We're concerned about his behavior. This kind of defiance can be a sign of deeper issues." A bitter laugh rose in her chest, but she swallowed it. "Defiance? Because he's gifted?" "Gifted?" the teacher scoffed under her breath, though she tried to hide it. Chancel straightened. "Malik took a logic exam last month. You told me he scored higher than the whole grade." The principal's tone tightened. Scores can be misleading when a child's emotional regulation is unstable. There it was, the coded language she'd heard before. The quiet criminalization of her child's intelligence. The attempt to turn brilliance into deficiency. She recognized the pattern as clearly as Malik recognized numbers. "Let me guess," Chantal said quietly. "You want to move him to the special needs program." "We believe it would be beneficial," the principal replied. "For him," the teacher added. "And for the class." Chantel felt heat rush behind her eyes. A mix of rage, disbelief, and an ache only mothers understood. She leaned forward, locked her gaze on theirs and said, "My son doesn't need to be hidden away because you're uncomfortable with how smart he is." The principal closed the folder. "Ms. Briggs, if you refuse evaluation, we'll have to note non-compliance on your record." Chantel inhaled slowly. "Do what you have to do, but I promise you, you're wrong about him." When she picked up Malik from school, he climbed into the car quietly. He didn't ask about the meeting. He didn't need to. He could feel the tension clinging to the air like dust. "Mom?" he whispered. "Yes, baby. Did I do something wrong?" Her throat tightened. "No, not one thing." Malik stared out the window. "Sometimes I feel like they want me to be smaller." Chantel reached over and squeezed his hand. "That's because they see something in you. They don't understand." He nodded slowly, though uncertainty clouded his expression. In that moment, Chantel felt a sudden fierce determination. She would not let the world shrink her child, not while she was breathing. That night, as Malik worked on a new pattern in his notebook, Chantel watched him with growing concern. She saw how quickly he processed information, how deeply he thought, how naturally he built meaning from chaos. She saw his gift, and she saw the danger it attracted in a world eager to keep him in a box. When she finally tucked him into bed, he whispered, "Mom, why don't they want me to be smart?" Her voice cracked. "Because some people fear what they don't understand." Malik nodded, burying himself under the blanket. "I just want to make things that make sense." "You will," she whispered. "I promise." She walked out quietly, but her heart was pounding. Because tomorrow morning, she knew the school would try something drastic. The next day, Chantel learned that Malik was about to be labeled special needs, despite scoring higher than his entire grade on a logic exam. The first time Malik sat through one of Dr. Ronald Given's live problem-solving sessions, something shifted inside him, something he couldn't name, only feel. It wasn't just that the numbers made sense. It was the way Given spoke of them. Not as answers to be memorized, but as languages waiting to be interpreted. Languages that, if understood deeply enough, could bend the rules the world claimed were fixed. Chantel watched from behind the screen on that first call. Her arms crossed tightly, her expression unreadable. She hadn't known what to expect from this reclusive mathematician, the one who had once been called the Black Euler, before he vanished from academia entirely. His face now bore the quiet weight of betrayal, but his voice carried something different. Hope. In the weeks that followed, Malik's mind bloomed like wildfire. Dr. Givens fed him dense academic texts, proofs once deemed inaccessible to undergrads. Malik not only kept up, he outran them. His notebooks became mazes of theory, symbols, graphs, and intuitions that didn't just solve problems but unraveled the assumptions inside them. But with brilliance came visibility, and with visibility came threat. What began as quiet study sessions soon spilled into online discussion forums, where Dr. Givens encouraged Malik to share fragments of his thinking anonymously, not for validation, but to test the integrity of his ideas against seasoned minds. At first, the response was confusion, then awe, then doubt. When users discovered Malik's age and identity, not from him but through traces left behind, the tone shifted overnight. Anonymous accounts accused him of faking. Some claimed his work had to be computer-generated. A few went further, suggesting Dr. Givens was the true author, using Malik as a racial stunt. One comment hit harder than the rest. No way a kid from a single mother, Waffle House zip code is outsmarting postdocs. Let's be serious. Chantel read the post in silence, the words vibrating beneath her skin like an old injury reopened. But Malik, he didn't blink. He was already deep into something new, something vast and strange that Dr. Givens had only whispered about once. It was called the Meissner conjecture, an unsolved problem involving prime number grids and pattern collapses. Mathematicians had poked at it for decades. The problem wasn't just about numbers, it was about structure, predictability, and randomness itself. To solve it would mean redefining how logic was applied in complex systems, including encryption, machine learning, even predictive policing algorithms. Dr. Givens had said it was the Rubik's Cube of theoretical mathematics, unsolved not because it was impossible, but because it required the kind of mind the field had refused to recognize. Malik, drawn in by the chaos of it, began to toy with the structure in his own way. He didn't just look at formulas. He drew them, colored them, saw the patterns moving in and out of one another like living things. His brain mapped logic like instinct. By the third week of working on the Meissner conjecture, Malik stumbled across something unusual. A symmetry that should not have existed in the arrangement of prime grids across a 17 by 17 matrix. A gap where randomness should have prevailed, but instead repeated with eerie consistency. He didn't fully understand what it meant, but he chased it anyway. Givens noticed the shift immediately. Malik's notes became sharper, more abstract. He stopped asking questions and started making assumptions. Correct ones. Then, one night, he submitted an unorthodox solution through a private academic portal, using only his initials. It wasn't polished, it wasn't formal, but it outlined a possible method to collapse and reconstitute the Meissner grid, using recursive primes, something that had never been proposed before. Within 48 hours, the forum administrators flagged the submission, not for error, but for suspicion. A prominent university board, recognizing the originality of the work, demanded to know the author's credentials. When they traced the IP and uncovered the submission came from a minor, and a black child at that, they froze the thread and launched an internal review. Publicly, they said they were investigating academic misconduct. Privately, they called it plagiarism. Chantel was notified not by the university, but by an email from a sympathetic forum moderator. Her hands trembled as she read the accusations, not just because they doubted Malik, but because they were already crafting a narrative that erased him entirely. Dr. Givens was livid, but not surprised. He explained that Malik had unknowingly stumbled into a minefield. The Meissner conjecture wasn't just an academic challenge. It was a kind of intellectual land grab. Multiple institutions had unofficial teams working on it in secret, hoping for first rights to a solution that would make them legendary and profitable. Whoever solved it would earn more than accolades. They would be able to license their method to governments, corporations, even surveillance systems. And now, a child from Georgia had beaten them to the blueprint. The board didn't care whether it was original. They only cared that it didn't come from someone they approved of, someone they could own. The accusations escalated. Experts were called in to analyze the style of the work. One reviewer called it suspiciously advanced. Another said it resembled previous attempts from a university lab, though no such proof was provided. The implication was enough. Malik was a fraud. Online, the harassment worsened. Malik's username was doxed. Chantel's diner job became a point of ridicule in forums. Memes were made mocking her as the mom who thought her boy was smarter than MIT. The humiliation wasn't just intellectual. It was racial, maternal, economic. Every angle of their life became ammunition. But through it all, Malik didn't stop. If anything, the pressure made him sharper. He began documenting every step of his work, building a trail no one could dispute. He even found gaps in previous published attempts, proving that his method wasn't just original, but more elegant than those attempted by funded research teams. Still, none of that seemed to matter. The board's decision arrived by letter. Official language. Cold wording. The solution was rejected on grounds of suspected academic dishonesty. They recommended Malik be banned from submitting to affiliated platforms for 2 years. A quiet exile. Chantel sat on the floor that night, the letter in her lap, her back against the couch. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stared into the distance, as if trying to see the point where all this had turned, where genius had become a liability. Dr. Givens, however, had other plans. He forwarded the solution to a trusted colleague at Caltech. Quietly, without fanfare, not to prove Malik's innocence, but to validate his method, to force the question back onto the institution that had dismissed him. The colleague responded within hours. The message was brief. This needs to be seen. But the most unexpected twist came the next morning. A second email arrived, not from Caltech, not from Givens, but from someone even more powerful, the chair of an independent logic foundation based in Zurich, an international consortium that had quietly monitored the Meissner conjecture for years. They had seen the flagged submission. They had analyzed it, and they wanted Malik to present his framework, in person. Chantel reread the email 3 times before she believed it. There were no apologies, no acknowledgement of the harm done, just a formal request, and a signed NDA. Dr. Givens warned her it wouldn't be simple. Accepting the offer meant walking into the same academic halls that had just tried to erase her son. But Malik had already made his decision. He would go. Not to prove himself. To finish what he started, Malik submitted an unorthodox solution to a decades-old puzzle, and a university board accused him of plagiarism. But now an international institution wanted to fly him out. Quietly. The air in the house felt different after the Zurich email. It wasn't excitement. Not yet. It was something heavier. Like knowing you've uncovered a secret the world wasn't ready for, and that you'd be punished for speaking it out loud. Malik sat at the kitchen table, staring at the screen where the message had arrived, the blue glow reflecting off his face like moonlight. Chantel hovered nearby, silent. She didn't know what to say anymore. Words had begun to fail in the face of everything they were up against. The rejection from the university board still lingered like smoke. No matter how many experts quietly confirmed Malik's logic held up, the public record now labeled him as a cheat. A fraud. Someone who had either stolen the work or let a machine do it for him. His name, once a whisper of possibility, was now trending, for all the wrong reasons. It began with a single tweet from an academic blogger who'd seen the submission before it was pulled. The thread, meant to raise questions, exploded in the worst way. Screenshots of Malik's forum posts surfaced. Users dissected his grammar, his sentence structure, his age. They mocked his zip code. They speculated about his father. They questioned whether Chantel even had a son or was just using stock photos and AI-generated math as a stunt. One phrase echoed louder than the rest. No kid from a Waffle House neighborhood solves that puzzle. It wasn't a statement. It was a sentence, one meant to box Malik back into the boundaries of what people expected. Black children from poor neighborhoods to be, not prodigies, not pioneers, but anomalies at best, liabilities at worst. Chantel tried to shield Malik from it, but he wasn't blind. He saw the headlines, talk shows that invited experts, who without reading a single line of his work, claimed it was impossible for a child his age to produce such a solution. Some called it AI-generated. Others insisted it was ghostwritten by Givens. One said flatly, "We've seen these kinds of scams before. A feel-good story designed to make a political point." The twist, of course, was that none of these people had ever spoken to Malik. They hadn't seen his notebooks. They hadn't witnessed his process. They hadn't sat beside him while he mapped recursive grids across pages, like a composer scoring a symphony. They just saw the color of his skin and the address attached to his submissions, And from there, the judgment was easy. The attacks got personal. Users posted satellite images of the diner where Chantel worked. They dug up an old Facebook post where she'd mentioned financial stress. One edited a video to make it look like Malik had been coached during a tutoring session, slowing it down to frame his pauses as moments of cheating. The manipulation was crude, but effective. Then it crossed into real life. One afternoon, as Chantel poured coffee for a customer in a corner booth, the man looked up with a smirk and asked, "Aren't you the woman with the genius son?" Her throat tightened, but she nodded, proudly. He leaned back. "Thought so. Shame about that whole cheating thing. Guess we all want to believe our kids are special, huh?" Chantel held the pot steady. She didn't respond. "Or maybe you just figured it was your ticket out of here," he added. "Get enough attention, someone might throw a book deal your way." The coffee dripped over the edge of the mug. As her hand trembled slightly, the man didn't stop smiling. The manager called her into the backroom later that day. He wasn't angry. He was uncomfortable. Said some customers had expressed concern. Said the attention was bad for business. Said they were letting her go. Temporarily, of course. Just until things cooled down. But Chantel knew what that meant. She didn't argue. She just grabbed her bag and walked out into the cold, late afternoon air with the kind of silence that always came before something broke. At home, Malik noticed the way her shoulders sagged. He didn't ask why. He just closed his laptop and said he wasn't hungry. Dr. Givens tried to intervene. He reached out to publications, academic allies, even former colleagues. A few responded, privately. They admired Malik's work, they said. They believed him. But no one wanted to stake their name publicly. Not against the momentum of accusation, not against the racial undercurrents that had always whispered, but now screamed. The more they tried to correct the narrative, the louder the disbelief became. Then in a small, brightly lit office in California, something unexpected happened. A professor named Dr. Sandra Velez, head of applied logic at Caltech, stumbled across the Zurich Foundation's internal report on the Meissner submission. She hadn't been looking for it. It came through a data thread she used to track unsolved grid problems for her own research. But what she saw stopped her cold. The submission didn't just propose a new approach. It exposed a structural flaw in the way most researchers were even framing the problem. It suggested that the entire foundation of the Meissner grid had been misunderstood, and that the supposed impossibility of a solution came not from complexity, but from arrogance. Dr. Velez requested the raw work. What she received stunned her further. The notes weren't dressed up in academic polish. They weren't formatted for journals. But they were alive with intuition, cross-referenced patterns, recursive logic chains that were breathtaking in their elegance and terrifying in their implication. Because if they were real, if a 10-year-old black boy had written them, then everyone else had missed something massive. Dr. Velez didn't alert the media. She didn't tell her colleagues. She sent one message to Dr. Givens. It was an invitation, not for a lecture, not for publication, for a closed-door presentation, under strict conditions. No cameras, no audience, just a handful of logic scholars, mathematicians, and one ethics observer. Dr. Givens relayed the offer to Chantel the next morning. He made it clear, this wasn't redemption. It was an opportunity. One that could backfire. One that could also, for the first time, put Malik in a room where people would listen to him. Not because of a media frenzy, but because of the math. Chantel hesitated. The Zurich offer was still on the table, but this was different. This was domestic, strategic, and it could shift the tone of the conversation if it went right. She asked Malik what he wanted. He said he wanted to be heard. That was all. So they said yes. Malik prepared in silence. For the next 2 days. No press. No interviews. Just him, Givens, and a small room filled with equations and ideas no one had ever seen before. Chantel watched him sleep on the couch with his papers scattered like fallen leaves around him. He looked small again, but the storm he was building was anything but. They flew to California in silence. No announcements. No press. Just a single itinerary, and a driver who waited with a placard that read Givens Party. The campus at Caltech was bright, clean, clinical. Malik clutched his notebook tightly as they walked through the glass doors and into a waiting room where a receptionist barely looked up. She called someone, then asked them to wait. Minutes passed. A man in a blazer arrived and gestured them into a conference room. White walls, a blackboard, and 6 seats facing it like a tribunal. No names, No title, just eyes. Dr. Velez entered last. She didn't smile. She simply nodded and said they could begin. Malik stepped up to the board, heart pounding, hands steady. He opened his notebook and, without speaking, began writing. Line by line, pattern by pattern, proof by proof. The room watched in silence, until someone whispered something that wasn't meant to be heard, but still reached Chantel's ears from across the space. Either this kid is a genius, a pot, or we've all been wasting our careers. But what happened next would challenge even that assumption. Because as Malik continued, something strange began to emerge in his solution. Something that didn't just solve the Meissner puzzle. It exposed a new problem hidden within the original. A pattern that no one had predicted. And that pattern had implications far beyond math. It touched encryption, security, even artificial intelligence. Caltech quietly invited Malik and Dr. Givens to present the solution. But his live proof revealed a hidden pattern no one had anticipated. And now, a government agency had quietly taken notice. The lab was nothing like Malik had imagined. It wasn't high-tech or futuristic. It was sterile, silent, and uncomfortably cold. 4 walls, 1 whiteboard, and a long rectangular table where 4 tenured professors sat, their expressions unreadable. A small camera was mounted in the corner, not for documentation but for verification. Everything Malik did would be recorded, time-stamped, scrutinized. He stood just a few feet away from them, hands trembling at his sides. The marker in his fingers felt heavier than any pencil he'd ever held. Behind the double doors, down the hallway, his mother waited, barred from entering, not because she was disruptive, but because the institution insisted on minimal distraction. She'd kissed his forehead before he entered, whispering words he tried to carry into the room like armor. But in front of this silent tribunal, the armor felt paper-thin. Dr. Givens was the only familiar face in the room, standing silently in the far corner, allowed only as a silent observer. He nodded once, barely just enough for Malik to notice. It was all he needed. The lead professor, a silver-haired man with an icy calm, gestured to the board and stated the protocol. Malik would need to rederive his solution, explain the logical structure aloud, and address any questions in real time. No notes, no assistance, no delays. If the pattern emerged as claimed, they would reconsider the plagiarism verdict. If not, the entire case would be closed, not just dismissed, but discredited. Malik stepped to the board. His hand shook as he drew the first line, then the second. But something inside him, something deeper than fear, took over. Call it instinct, call it clarity, call it defiance. The numbers flowed, slowly at first, then with confidence. Recursive sequences unrolled across the surface, like musical bars, looping, folding, expanding. He spoke as he worked, explaining the architecture of his proof. The voices in his mind that had doubted him, the headlines, the trolls, the teachers who told him to sit down faded into silence. The professors sat motionless, notebooks open but untouched. Their eyes tracked every number, every variable, every shift in his approach. What none of them expected, not even Givens, was what happened next. Malik paused at one line. His eyes scanned what he'd written, then narrowed. He erased 2 steps, rewrote them, and added a new axis. Something he hadn't done before. Something that hadn't appeared in his original submission. A subtle change. A structural twist. The equations that followed weren't just revisions. They were evolutions. He wasn't recreating his work. He was improving it. One professor leaned forward. Malik adjusted the symmetry, then layered a counter-variable across the prime distribution, a shift that exposed a new anomaly buried within the Meissner grid. It was subtle, almost accidental, but it rewrote the approach entirely. Not only had he solved the problem, he had revealed that the problem itself was misdefined from the start. It took him 90 minutes. When he stepped back from the board, the room was silent. One professor whispered, "This is going to break people." Another one stood, walked to the board, and began to trace the pattern silently with his finger. His breath hitched halfway through. Outside, Chantel checked her phone for the 100th time. No updates, no messages, just the growing sense that whatever was happening behind that door, it was bigger than either of them had anticipated. Then her phone buzzed. She opened it instinctively and froze. A video, 30 seconds long, posted anonymously. Malik, walking through Caltech's side entrance. No sound, just the image. a child in a hoodie, flanked by Givens, and a faculty escort. The caption read, "Guess who's getting a free pass? Affirmative action at its finest." Her heart sank. The comments were already flooding in. "They're testing kids now? More DI math fraud. This is what happens when you let woke politics into STEM." Someone had leaked it. Someone inside. And the firestorm erupted instantly. Chantel stared at the screen, blood draining from her face. She had felt this before, not the viral attention, but the venom wrapped in disbelief. This wasn't about Malik's proof anymore. This was about who he was, where he came from, and what he represented. His success wasn't being challenged, it was being punished. Inside the lab, none of them yet knew what was unfolding online. Malik stood quietly, as the professors finished reviewing his final steps. One of them asked him to explain the symmetry anomaly again, not because he didn't understand, but because he wanted to be sure he wasn't hallucinating. Malik repeated it slowly. The anomaly wasn't a bug. It was a flaw in the grid's foundational assumption, one that had gone unnoticed for decades, because no one had bothered to question it. The lead professor, who had remained silent the entire time, finally spoke. His voice was low. "Even. This will need independent review. But if verified, your structure challenges the standard logic models used in prime prediction algorithms. That's not just theoretical. That has operational implications." Malik nodded, unsure if that was praise or threat. Dr. Givens cleared his throat, finally breaking silence. "Operational how?" The professor didn't respond directly. He just said the session was complete. Malik left the room, not with applause, but with uncertainty. His proof had held, but something had shifted, not just in the room, but in the air around them. Outside, Chantel was waiting, phone still in her hand. The look on her face said everything. Malik asked if something was wrong. She didn't answer immediately. She just handed him the phone. He read the comments in silence. His shoulders slumped, but his eyes stayed focused. The fire inside him, dimmed by exhaustion, flared again. The proof wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Not for them. But maybe, just maybe, it was enough for something bigger. Givens caught up to them at the car. He already knew about the leak. His phone was ringing nonstop. He said the quiet part out loud. "They'll try to bury this. Not the math. You." But Malik had a different look in his eyes now. Not fear. Not even defiance. Readiness. What none of them realized yet, not Chantel, not Givens, not even Malik himself, was that someone else had been watching the presentation remotely. A third-party observer embedded quietly into the ethics committee. An observer who didn't belong to the academic world, but to a government agency focused on systems security, cryptography, and artificial intelligence. That observer had seen the pattern Malik uncovered, and had recognized it for what it truly was, not just a mathematical breakthrough, but a vulnerability. A crack in the encryption methods used by federal and corporate systems around the world. Malik hadn't just rewritten a math problem. He had inadvertently exposed a weakness in the architecture of national cybersecurity. And now, eyes far more powerful than any professor were turning toward him. Malik's solution not only held up, it revealed a hidden pattern that rewrote part of what scholars thought they knew. And now someone outside the academic world had taken notice. Someone who never showed up unless the stakes were national. The footage leaked without warning. 37 minutes of grainy, silent lab video captured from the ceiling camera in Caltech's secure room. Malik's figure stood small in front of a massive whiteboard, numbers flowing like music from his hand. His presence was quiet but commanding, and unmistakably young. The internet latched onto it immediately. The video was reposted with captions ranging from admiration to outrage. Within 12 hours, it hit 2 million views. Within 24, it doubled. A popular journalist tweeted a screenshot of Malik mid-equation, with the caption, "The black Einstein they never wanted us to see." It should have been a moment of celebration. But Malik's brilliance didn't just trend, it detonated. Some called him a genius, others called him a fraud. Many questioned how a child, especially a black child from a low-income zip code, could walk into Caltech and rewrite parts of theoretical math. The video became ammunition for every side of the cultural debate, every voice looking to spin a story. But none of them spoke to Malik. They only spoke about him. Celebrities added their voices. Athletes, authors, politicians. Overnight, Malik became a symbol, not of mathematics, but of racial disruption, of brilliance in the wrong body. And when a symbol starts to scare the wrong people, it doesn't take long for violence to follow. The first hit was online. Chantel's social media was flooded with threats, from burners, trolls, and what looked like coordinated bot campaigns. Someone posted a manipulated image of her holding a fake check for $5 million. Captioned, "Grift level unlocked." Then came the real-world hate. Malik's school was defaced 2 days after the footage went viral. Slurs painted across the main entrance. The front office window shattered. Flyers posted that read, "No tokens in STEM." Malik didn't cry when he saw it. He just went quiet. That same night, Chantel's apartment was hit. The door was tagged with red spray paint. The word liar stretched across the porch wall. A note was left under her windshield, typed unsigned, "Take your monkey and run." Dr. Givens received worse. Doxing began on niche extremist sites. His old address, his family members, even private financial records. He'd already been in hiding from academic politics. But this was different. This was targeted. He packed a bag and disappeared, contacting Chantel through encrypted apps. He warned her. This wasn't about math anymore. It was about narrative warfare, and their family had become the enemy of the wrong machine. Caltech refused to comment. The professors who had witnessed the session issued no formal defense. Their silence was deafening. None would put their name next to Malik's. Not while the backlash grew. Not while political figures began using the boy's name in speeches about meritocracy being under siege. Then came the knock at the door. It wasn't press. It wasn't police. It was a pair of federal agents. Quiet, polite, yet unmistakably serious. They arrived without cameras, without warrants, only an urgent safety briefing. Malik was told to step outside as Chantel sat down. They explained, in clinical terms, that Malik's name had been flagged by multiple domestic extremist watch lists. They said encrypted forums had mentioned potential action. They did not say attack. They used the word disruption. It sounded clean, sanitized. Chantel asked what they were supposed to do. The answer came fast. Relocate. Immediately. Witness protection. Rebranded as a federal relocation program. She hesitated. But when the agents mentioned Malik's school being targeted again, this time with a failed firebomb thrown overnight, she didn't argue. They left Georgia, under cover of dawn. No goodbyes. No warning. Just bags. New names. And a location. Malik would not be told until they arrived. His silence on the drive wasn't fear. It was something deeper. A mourning of place, identity, roots, traded for survival. They arrived in Colorado, a sterile apartment in a bland suburb with white walls and government furniture. New names were assigned. Malik became Mark. Chantel became Carla. A social worker was assigned. A new school too, one that didn't know who he was, or what he'd done, at least not officially. But silence doesn't erase legacy. Whispers began almost immediately. A student recognized Malik's face from a TikTok video that refused to die. One teacher pulled Chantel aside, gently suggesting, it might be better if he kept a low profile. Malik withdrew. His notebook stayed shut. The whiteboard that once filled his old bedroom now sat in storage. Then came the envelope. Unmarked. No stamp. Just slipped under the door one morning. Inside, a business card, matte black, gold lettering. Victor Stone. Synthesis Capital. Chantel stared at the name. It meant nothing to her at first. But the card was warm, like it had been handled just moments earlier. Attached to it was a simple note. I know who you are. I know what your son can do. Let's talk. Full security. Zero agenda. One condition. You come to me. There was a phone number with a private line. No explanation. Chantel hesitated for days. She researched Victor Stone, piecing together a profile built from contradictions. A black tech billionaire who had disappeared from public life after a massive AI ethics scandal. Once praised as the Silicon Alchemist, Stone had vanished after whistleblower leaks suggested his AI systems were involved in controversial surveillance projects overseas. Still, he wasn't a stranger to genius. He wasn't afraid of backlash. And he wasn't part of any institution that had turned its back on Malik. She dialed the number. The voice that answered was direct. Male, not Stone himself, but someone from his private operations team. The man already knew their location, already had files on their relocation. And he made the offer clear. Stone wanted Malik, enrolled in the private institute he ran out of state, a closed campus tech haven for prodigies. No media, No press, just research, mentorship, and complete privacy. It wasn't registered on any public database, funded entirely off books, attended by less than 50 students worldwide, all hand-picked. Chantel asked why. The answer paused the room. Because Stone believed Malik had touched a code fragment that resembled something he'd seen before, something buried deep in old encryption protocols from a classified DARPA project Stone had consulted on years ago. He believed Malik's discovery wasn't just theoretical. He believed it exposed a flaw Stone had once covered up, and that flaw was about to resurface in a way that no one was prepared for. Still, the man insisted this wasn't about exploitation. Stone didn't want to own Malik's mind. He wanted to protect it. Chantel agreed to a meeting, privately, off-grid, on her terms. They flew again, this time to an undisclosed facility in the Nevada desert. When Stone entered the glass room where Chantel and Malik waited, he didn't wear a suit, no entourage, just him. Older than his photos, eyes sharp, skin weathered by both sun and scandal. He sat across from Malik and didn't ask questions. He made observations. Noticed the way Malik tapped his pencil 3 times before solving a problem. Noticed how he blinked rapidly before reaching a logical leap. He wasn't watching for intelligence. He was watching for patterns. After an hour, Stone made the offer official. Full scholarship, private residence, unlimited access to computing labs, and a guarantee, no public exposure. Malik looked to Chantel. Her face was unreadable. But before she could speak, Stone said something that pulled the floor out from under them both. He knew Malik's father. Knew him not just as a name, but as a former coder who once worked with Stone on the same DARPA contract. Knew that man had vanished from the industry after a whistleblower report cost them both their careers.
And knew something else.
That Malik's pattern of problem-solving wasn't just similar to his father's. It was identical. The offer came from a tech billionaire with his own controversial past, and a secret tie to Malik's father, a father Chantel had never told Malik existed. Victor Stone's institute wasn't listed on maps. It didn't boast rankings or brochures. There were no press releases, no alumni networks, no public lectures. What it had instead was silence. A fortress of intellect, tucked into the wooded cliffs of Northern California, built not for exposure, but for protection. Every building on campus was minimal and matte, low to the ground, glass and steel disappearing into trees. The message was clear. Brilliance didn't need to announce itself. Malik stepped off the private shuttle with a mix of awe and suspicion. The grounds felt like a dream he hadn't allowed himself to want. Quiet halls, advanced labs, faces like his, browned, brilliant and unbothered. Students worked on quantum simulations, drone coordination, neural networks, all without adults hovering. It was a world built for minds that didn't fit in the world they came from. Stone called it asylum for the exceptional. A place where black brilliance didn't have to translate itself for white audiences, where potential wasn't filtered through pity or politics. He walked Malik and Chantel through the facilities personally, pointing to solar-powered architecture, AI-driven classrooms, encryption-secure dorms. Everything was optimized, except the expectations. Those, Stone said, were limitless. But the invitation wasn't just about sanctuary. It was about legacy. Stone was aging. Not visibly. His energy still snapped like electricity. But Malik noticed it in the way his eyes lingered on screens, as if searching for something he hadn't yet built. In Malik, he didn't just see genius. He saw an echo of something unfinished. Chantel remained cautious. She watched every move, every promise, with the scrutiny of a mother who'd already lost too much to powerful men who smiled too easily. Stone's name came with baggage. The AI ethics fallout, the classified contract scandal, the whispers about his MIT exile. But Malik didn't hesitate. For the first time in months, he felt unboxed. No one here was trying to shrink him. His notebooks were devoured instead of dismissed. His unorthodox methods were praised, not punished. He wasn't disruptive. He was. And yet, even in this sanctuary, shadows crept in. Within the first week, Stone pulled Chantel into a private meeting. His voice was firm but not unkind. He told her Malik's work had triggered silent alerts inside systems they monitored. Systems tied to federal cybersecurity grids and private contractors. The patterns Malik was building weren't just beautiful. They were dangerous. Not because of what they did, but because of what they exposed. Malik's method of recursive folding didn't just apply to math problems. It could deconstruct logic-based encryption, the kind used in top-tier digital security. Stone's team had been tracking it since the Caltech demonstration. Now agencies were watching too. Chantel's stomach dropped. She asked if they were safe. Stone didn't say yes. Instead, he showed her something. A sandboxed program. A simulation of a military-grade encryption test, based on old DARPA specs. A puzzle designed to take elite systems 72 hours to decode. He asked if Malik could try it. Chantel refused. Stone nodded, but told her quietly that Malik already had. Malik had seen the model running in the lab. No one told him what it was. He asked questions, made observations, then went to work. 14 minutes later, he submitted a restructured key that collapsed the entire sequence. It wasn't a fluke. It was a revelation. Stone looked at Chantel with an intensity that didn't feel like pride. It felt like warning. Malik hadn't just cracked a code. He had proven something terrifying, that a 10-year-old black boy, untrained and unsupervised, could dismantle the digital skeleton of national defense. And someone else had noticed. The next morning, before the sun cut through the trees, 2 men appeared outside the gate. Black suits. No insignia. Identical briefcases. They weren't violent. They weren't loud. They were polite and insistent. They requested a consultation. Stone refused. The men said nothing. They handed over a sealed envelope and left. Inside was a contract. It didn't ask for custody or control. It asked for cooperation, phrased in vague legalese. It referred to collaborative development, national interests, and security reinforcement. It offered a stipend. It offered immunity. It also included a thinly veiled threat. Failure to comply may result in oversight complications regarding parental guardianship and educational clearance. Chantel read the lines over and over. Her breath caught. They weren't asking. They were preparing to take. Stone's team began to implement countermeasures. Encrypted communication, facial recognition barriers, network scrubbing. But Stone warned that once the government showed interest, walls became meaningless. The only weapon left was exposure. If they tried to move in silence, they could be silenced. But if the world saw what Malik had done, not the headlines, not the race baiting, but the math, then maybe they'd think twice. But exposure came with a price. Malik didn't want fame. He wanted freedom. He spent his days in the lab, coding, writing, solving, but now he also looked over his shoulder. One of the other students, a 17-year-old girl named Nia, warned him to watch his back. She'd seen this before, she said. Black brilliance being recruited into government projects that started as promises and ended in silence. But Nia also saw something else. She watched Malik build a simulation engine, one that could generate logic flaws in layered AI models. When she asked him why he was doing it, he didn't answer. But she saw the notebook pages in his bag, and one of them had a familiar name in the corner. Darius Cross. She asked who that was. Malik paused. He didn't know yet, but Chantel did. That night, as she tucked away documents in her room, she pulled out a photo, folded, worn, faded, a man, younger than Stone, standing beside a chalkboard filled with binary code. His eyes sharp, his smile quiet. On the back it read, Darius, 2007. First proof sketch. Still makes no sense to me. Chantel held the photo to her chest. She had kept it hidden for years, buried the name, buried the story, buried the truth. But now it was surfacing again, in Malik's math, in Stone's offer, in the government's interest. She looked at her son across the hall, asleep with his notebook still open. The past was no longer past. It was multiplying in front of them. Malik cracked a military-grade encryption challenge in 14 minutes, and 2 men in black suits showed up the next morning, forcing Chantel to confront the secret she never told, that Malik's father wasn't missing. He was silenced. Victor Stone's institute wasn't listed on maps. It didn't boast rankings or brochures. There were no press releases, no alumni networks, no public lectures. What it had instead was silence. A fortress of intellect, tucked into the wooded cliffs of Northern California, built not for exposure, but for protection. Every building on campus was minimal and matte, low to the ground, glass and steel disappearing into trees. The message was clear. Brilliance didn't need to announce itself. Malik stepped off the private shuttle with a mix of awe and suspicion. The grounds felt like a dream he hadn't allowed himself to want. Quiet halls, Advanced labs. Faces like his. Brown, brilliant, and unbothered. Students worked on quantum simulations, drone coordination, neural networks, all without adults hovering. It was a world built for minds that didn't fit in the world they came from. Stone called it asylum for the exceptional. A place where black brilliance didn't have to translate itself for white audiences, where potential wasn't filtered through pity or politics. He walked Malik and Chantel through the facilities personally, pointing to solar-powered architecture, AI-driven classrooms, encryption-secure dorms. Everything was optimized, except the expectations. Those, Stone said, were limitless. But the invitation wasn't just about sanctuary. It was about legacy. Stone was aging, not visibly. His energy still snapped like electricity. But Malik noticed it in the way his eyes lingered on screens, as if searching for something he hadn't yet built. In Malik, he didn't just see genius. He saw an echo of something unfinished. Chantel remained cautious. She watched every move, every promise with the scrutiny of a mother who'd already lost too much to powerful men, who smiled too easily. Stone's name came with baggage. The AI ethics fallout, the classified contract scandal, the whispers about his MIT exile. But Malik didn't hesitate. For the first time in months, he felt unboxed. No one here was trying to shrink him. His notebooks were devoured instead of dismissed. His unorthodox methods were praised, not punished. He wasn't disruptive. He was seen. And yet, even in this sanctuary, shadows crept in. Within the first week, Stone pulled Chantel into a private meeting. His voice was firm, but not unkind. He told her Malik's work had triggered silent alerts inside systems they monitored. Systems tied to federal cybersecurity grids and private contractors. The patterns Malik was building weren't just beautiful. They were dangerous. Not because of what they did, but because of what they exposed. Malik's method of recursive folding didn't just apply to math problems. It could deconstruct logic-based encryption, the kind used in top-tier digital security. Stone's team had been tracking it since the Caltech demonstration. Now, agencies were watching too. Chantel's stomach dropped. She asked if they were safe. Stone didn't say yes. Instead, he showed her something. A sandboxed program. A simulation of a military-grade encryption test, based on old DARPA specs. A puzzle designed to take elite systems 72 hours to decode. He asked if Malik could try it. Chantel refused. Stone nodded but told her quietly that Malik already had. Malik had seen the model running in the lab. No one told him what it was. He asked questions, made observations, then went to work. 14 minutes later, he submitted a restructured key that collapsed the entire sequence. It wasn't a fluke, it was a revelation. Stone looked at Chantel with an intensity that didn't feel like pride. It felt like warning. Malik hadn't just cracked a code. He had proven something terrifying, that a 10-year-old black boy, untrained and unsupervised, could dismantle the digital skeleton of national defense. And someone else had noticed. The next morning, before the sun cut through the trees, 2 men appeared outside the gate. Black suits. No insignia. Identical briefcases. They weren't violent. They weren't loud. They were polite and insistent. They requested a consultation. Stone refused. The men said nothing. They handed over a sealed envelope and left. Inside was a contract. It didn't ask for custody or control. It asked for cooperation, phrased in vague legalese. It referred to collaborative development, national interests, and security reinforcement. It offered a stipend. It offered immunity. It also included a thinly veiled threat. Failure to comply may result in oversight complications regarding parental guardianship and educational clearance. Chantel read the lines over and over. Her breath caught. They weren't asking. They were preparing to take. Stone's team began to implement countermeasures. Encrypted communication, facial recognition barriers, network scrubbing. But Stone warned that once the government showed interest, walls became meaningless. The only weapon left was exposure. If they tried to move in silence, they could be silenced. But if the world saw what Malik had done, not the headlines, not the race baiting, but the math, then maybe they'd think twice. But exposure came with a price. Malik didn't want fame. He wanted freedom. He spent his days in the lab, coding, writing, solving. But now he also looked over his shoulder. One of the other students, a 17-year-old girl named Nia, warned him to watch his back. She'd seen this before, she said. Black brilliance being recruited into government projects that started as promises and ended in silence. But Nia also saw something else. She watched Malik build a simulation engine, one that could generate logic flaws in layered AI models. When she asked him why he was doing it, he didn't answer. But she saw the notebook pages in his bag, and one of them had a familiar name in the corner. Darius Cross. She asked who that was. Malik paused. He didn't know yet, but Chantel did. That night, as she tucked away documents in her room, she pulled out a photo, folded, worn, faded. A man, younger than Stone, standing beside a chalkboard, filled with binary code. His eyes sharp, his smile quiet. On the back it read, Darius, 2007. First proof sketch. Still makes no sense to me. Chantal held the photo to her chest. She had kept it hidden for years. Buried the name. Buried the story. Buried the truth. But now it was surfacing again. In Malik's math. In Stone's offer. In the government's interest. She looked at her son across the hall, asleep with his notebook still open. The past was no longer past. It was multiplying in front of them. Malik cracked a military-grade encryption challenge in 14 minutes, and 2 men in black suits showed up the next morning, forcing Chantel to confront the secret she never told, that Malik's father wasn't missing. He was silenced. The men in black suits returned before sunrise, their silhouettes framed by the cold metallic sheen of Victor Stone's private campus. Despite their immaculate appearance and carefully practiced introductions, something about them carried the scent of intrusion rather than assistance. They claimed to be from a cybersecurity division tasked with assessing risks related to unconventional cryptographic breakthroughs. The phrasing was precise, intentional, and devoid of warmth. Malik felt the weight of their presence instantly, not because they were intimidating, but because they behaved as though his mind, not his humanity, was their jurisdiction. Their questions were sharp, pointed, and strangely rehearsed, as if they had memorized a script designed to guide him toward predetermined conclusions. They asked him to explain his recursive method, then pressed him about the encryption model he had cracked at Stone's Institute. Their eyes didn't track his hands or expressions, they tracked his thought patterns, noting pauses, hesitations, and shifts in tone. What unsettled Chantel most wasn't their questioning, but their decision to question him without her present. They waited until she stepped out of the room for a phone call from the school district, then immediately pulled their chairs closer to Malik. By the time she returned, they had extracted details that were never theirs to ask. She sensed it instantly, the change in Malik's posture, the slight tremor in his fingers, the way his gaze avoided hers as if unsure whether he had somehow betrayed her by answering. Stone intervened, before the agents could pull the conversation further into forbidden territory. His voice, calm yet unyielding, shifted the room's balance of power. He reminded them they were on private property, that any discussion involving a minor without parental supervision violated federal guidelines, and that the Institute's legal team had already been notified. The agents remained polite, masking irritation beneath professional neutrality, and insisted their goal was simply to offer Malik a national opportunity. The phrase hung in the air, like a trap disguised as a gift. They told Malik he had a responsibility to support national security developments. They said his pattern recognition placed him in a unique category of civic duty. They warned him, subtly but unmistakably, that attention from the press could complicate his safety and exacerbate tension. The warning wasn't for his protection. It was leverage. Chantel noticed the shift immediately. She recognized the tone. It was the same tone the school administrators had used when trying to push Malik into a program he didn't belong in. The tone that disguised coercion beneath a veneer of concern. After the agents left, Stone advised Chantel to increase her caution. His security team swept her assigned residence that evening, and what they found made her stomach lurch. A small wiretap device had been fixed beneath her kitchen table, its transmitter still warm. It was too sophisticated to be the work of amateurs. Whoever installed it had access, skill, and confidence. Chantel sat on the living room couch long after the sweep was complete, hands clasped tightly, her thoughts spiraling. She had known the world would resist Malik's rise. She had known his brilliance would attract scrutiny, but she hadn't imagined the scrutiny would reach into their home, burrowing into the spaces where they should have felt safe. Malik, unaware of the discovery, continued trying to work through new problems in the lab, but his progress faltered. The stress ate at him silently. Every keystroke he initiated was flagged by interference. His emails failed to send, messages to Dr. Givens disappeared into digital voids. The Institute's network registered unprecedented attempts to penetrate its encryption, attempts that Stone's team traced but could not identify. Each breach attempt coincided with moments Malik tried to communicate beyond the campus. It became clear. Someone was intercepting Malik's communication in real time. Stone understood the implications before anyone said it aloud. Malik's recursive grid method had exposed weaknesses in modern encryption, weaknesses embedded in major federal systems. If a child could collapse those systems in minutes, the architecture of national digital security could be undermined by anyone who replicated his pattern. To agencies tasked with protecting those structures, Malik wasn't a gifted child. He was a liability, a threat, a risk to national stability. The next day carried the weight of this realization in every step Chantel took. She attempted to remain composed, but she felt the tremors in her limbs, the tightening pressure in her chest. Malik sensed the shift too. He didn't need words to understand the fear creeping around the edges of their days. The silence between them transformed, not out of distance but out of the raw attempt to stay strong for each other. That strength was tested again when the agents returned, this time less conversational, more direct. They arrived with documents. They spoke with urgency. They presented forms that, if signed, would enroll Malik in a government program, under the jurisdiction of a classified division, granting him access to complex systems, and oversight by specialists trained in cryptographic innovation. To them, it was a developmental opportunity. To Chantel, it was possession disguised as partnership. They insisted this was the safest path. They claimed Malik's work had placed him at global risk. Foreign eyes had already taken interest, they said. They emphasized that only federal oversight could protect him from exploitation or harm. But Chantel remembered how these same voices had allowed his school to label him. How academic boards had dismissed him. How news anchor panels had questioned the legitimacy of his intelligence. How digital mobs had hunted her family. She didn't trust the sudden change in tone from skepticism to reverence, when the shift clearly hinged on what Malik could offer them. When she refused to sign, the atmosphere changed instantly. One agent leaned in, a quiet threat concealed behind professional pleasantries. He mentioned Malik's young age, implying that minors with advanced cognitive capabilities fell under special categories of evaluation, categories that could supersede traditional parental rights. He referenced cases where custody had been reassigned for the child's safety. His words were framed as caution, but the meaning was unmistakable. Refusal could be held against her. Chantel felt her heart slam against her ribs, but she did not back down. Stone entered then, stopping the conversation before it escalated further. His legal team arrived within minutes, and the agents were escorted out with diplomatic coldness. But the damage had already settled into the air like a stain, permanent, unavoidable. Malik's world tightened. Every movement felt watched. Every expression felt measured. Even the students at the institute sensed the shift around him. The atmosphere that once felt like possibility now felt heavy with implication. Later that night, Malik sat alone in the study space assigned to him. He tried to write equations, but his mind wouldn't settle. The numbers danced irregularly, refusing to connect. For the first time, he questioned whether his gift had become a curse, whether solving problems had created bigger ones, whether his existence had become too dangerous for the world. Chantel found him there, shoulders slumped, papers scattered. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply placed her hand on his back and sat with him, grounding him in a silence made of protection and pain. Her fear grew sharper, heavier, more suffocating with every passing hour. The threat wasn't academic anymore. It was maternal, existential. Stone joined them later, sharing information he'd kept quiet for days. Agencies beyond the two men had begun examining Malik's digital footprint. They were pulling surveillance logs, interviewing former teachers, even probing their old neighborhood. The intrusion wasn't limited to current dangers. It reached backward into their history. Malik wasn't simply under watch. He was under investigation. And the more Stone uncovered, the more convinced he became that the government wasn't trying to recruit Malik. They were trying to contain him. But containment required leverage. And leverage meant undermining Chantel. The truth surfaced that night in a moment of quiet horror. Stone received a message forwarded from a confidential source, within an oversight committee. A file containing a draft petition, unsigned but prepared, arguing that Chantel's refusal to comply with federal guidance constituted obstruction of national security cooperation, potentially rendering her unfit to safeguard a minor with advanced cognitive capability. Chantel read the document with trembling hands. It was a blueprint for taking Malik away.
Not next year.
Not if she committed a crime. Not if she endangered him. But if she simply refused to hand over his genius. Her breath faltered. Her vision blurred. The room tilted.
This wasn't pressure.
It was a threat. A direct, calculated warning that the weight of the state could be weaponized against her motherhood. Malik didn't see the document. But he saw her collapse into the chair, saw her hands cover her face, saw Stone's expression, a mix of fury and helplessness. He felt something he'd never felt before, the terror of losing not his freedom, but his mother. In that moment, numbers didn't matter, patterns didn't matter, the world didn't matter. Only her. One of the agents had made it clear if Malik didn't cooperate, they would revoke Chantel's custody. And now the paperwork to do it already existed. The morning after the meeting, Chantel walked Malik to school with a storm building quietly behind her eyes. Her stride was steady, but each step felt like a silent battle cry. She'd spent the night researching the school's policies, digging through forums, and reading the subtle ways black children were mislabeled under the guise of academic concern. The more she read, the clearer it became. Malik's intelligence wasn't being challenged. It was being contained. Malik didn't speak much during the walk. He sensed the tension, but didn't yet understand the full scale of what was unfolding around him. He only knew that the more he tried to learn, the more he felt like a problem to everyone else. Inside the school building, the hallways buzzed with the usual morning chaos. But when Malik stepped into his math classroom, the air shifted. His teacher, a white woman named Mrs. Donner, wore a smile that never touched her eyes. She watched him with a caution she never used on the other students. As the lesson began, she wrote a series of equations on the board. An early introduction to calculus patterns meant only for advanced placement. Malik's eyes lit up. This was where his mind came alive. He began solving the problem before she even finished explaining. His pencil moved with certainty, lines and arcs flowing in rhythms only he understood. As he looked up and raised his hand, he wasn't trying to boast. He simply saw something that didn't align in her example, a misstep in her logic chain. But the moment she saw his hand, something behind her expression hardened. She didn't ask him to speak. Instead, she repeated her explanation louder, as if silencing him through volume alone. When Malik politely interrupted, attempting to show the corrected pattern in his notes, she cut him off mid-sentence. The room went quiet. She labeled his behavior disruptive. Said he was showing off. Said he was undermining her teaching. No mention was made of whether he was right or wrong, only that he had stepped out of line. The message was clear. Being correct didn't matter if you embarrassed the wrong person. Later that afternoon, Malik sat alone in the counselor's office, facing questions masked in concern. Was he feeling frustrated in class? Did he often feel the need to take control of lessons? Did he struggle to follow rules? Each question was crafted carefully, wrapped in clinical language, but to Chantel, who was called in again without warning, it sounded like the preamble to a diagnosis no one had earned. They called it pattern defiance. They said it was consistent with gifted children who suffer from emotional dysregulation. Chantel listened, jaw tight, arms folded. They weren't seeing a child with vision. They were trying to justify his erasure. When she asked what Malik had done wrong, they couldn't point to anything concrete. They only repeated that he was difficult to manage, that he made other students uncomfortable, that he challenged the structure of the classroom. And when Chantel reminded them that learning should thrive on challenge, they grew quiet. The kind of quiet that came before a threat. The principal called it an early intervention. He suggested alternate educational environments, places with smaller classrooms, more behavioral support. The words dripped with rehearsed compassion, but the subtext was loud. Malik was too smart, too confident, too precise, and they didn't know what to do with a black boy who saw through their fear. Chantel walked out of the building that day carrying a fire she hadn't felt in years. This wasn't about behavior. This wasn't about support. This was about control. She understood now. Malik's intelligence made him dangerous to a system that only recognized brilliance when it came in a palatable form. At home, she stared at the ceiling long into the night. She thought about every table she'd waited on, every smirk from men who told her to stay in her place. She thought about how that same tone had found its way into her son's classroom. And then something inside her snapped. She opened her phone and typed a long post, part confession, part confrontation. She described Malik's gift, his ability to see numbers and patterns like a second language. She shared how the school had tried to reframe his brilliance as disobedience. She wrote about the meeting, the labels, the veiled threats. She didn't ask for sympathy. She asked for change. The post spread faster than she expected. Friends shared it. Then strangers. Then educators. Messages began to pour in. Some offered support. Others told her to stop making it about race. A few accused her of using her son for attention. But among the noise, one message stood out. It arrived late at night. No profile picture. A short note. No praise. No commentary. Just a question. Does Malik understand recursive prime distribution theory? Chantel stared at the message. She had no idea what that meant. But something about it felt serious. Not patronizing. Not performative. Just curious. She responded cautiously. The next message arrived moments later. I've spent 40 years watching gifted black minds get ignored. I'd like to speak with you. My name is Dr. Ronald Givens. The name meant nothing to Chantel at first. A quick search told her he was a retired mathematics professor, MIT, tenured at 32, disappeared from academia years ago, under strange circumstances. He hadn't given a lecture in over a decade, but his published papers were still cited by scholars around the world. Chantel read the thread of their conversation over and over again. His tone was direct. No pity, no flattery, just curiosity and clarity. He asked questions about how Malik thought, not what he knew. He referenced mathematical concepts Chantel couldn't pronounce, but he also understood something no one else did. Malik didn't need discipline. He needed depth. The next day, Dr. Givens requested a video call. He wanted to see Malik work. Chantel hesitated. She was still reeling from how quickly the school had turned on them, still weighing whether this was just another adult fascinated by black talent, until it became inconvenient. But there was something different here. Givens wasn't trying to rescue anyone. He was simply asking to see what the world refused to look at. When Malik sat down in front of the camera that evening, he didn't know what to expect. The screen flickered. Givens' face appeared, older, sharp-eyed, quiet. He asked Malik a question. Malik answered, then another, and another. By the fifth question, Givens sat back, silent. Chantel watched from the doorway, unsure what was happening. Then Givens spoke. His voice was calm, but his next words carried a weight that shattered the silence. Your son just replicated the beginning of a proof that took me 6 years to understand. And he's 10. Chantel couldn't speak. The air thickened. She felt dizzy, like the world had just cracked open. Givens explained that Malik's pattern recognition was beyond anything he'd seen in a decade. That his mental process was not only advanced, it was unorthodox, intuitive, unteachable. He didn't want to mentor Malik. He wanted to learn from him. But that wasn't all. Givens had been working on a mathematical problem for over 15 years. Something unsolved. Something so obscure it lived in the shadowy corners of academic research. It was considered impossible to solve without AI assistance. Malik had unknowingly mapped the early framework of that very problem. And then Givens said the words that would change everything. If your son is willing, I want to introduce him to something. But you both need to be prepared. Once he steps into this world, they'll come for him harder than you've ever seen. Chantel asked what he meant. Givens didn't answer directly. He only said that brilliance wasn't enough. That being right wasn't protection. And that when a black child solved the wrong kind of problem, the world had a way of turning against him fast. Chantel knew he wasn't exaggerating. She had already seen the beginning of that turn. But now, the stakes were higher. Because Malik wasn't just advanced. He was about to solve something the world didn't want solved. A retired MIT professor named Dr. Ronald Givens had just entered their lives, and he wasn't offering mentorship. He was offering a portal into a world that had already destroyed men who looked like Malik. The court summons arrived, not through the front door, but via a quiet knock from a private courier. The envelope bore no seal, just a series of legal codes, line items, and case numbers. Chantel had never seen before, but the subject line hit like a punch to the chest. Custody petition, Child Protective Services versus Chantel Briggs. She read the document 3 times before she could feel her hands again. The allegations were carefully constructed, a web of bureaucratic language masking something brutal. Claims of psychological endangerment, accusations that Malik was being subjected to unregulated intellectual exposure, and undue pressure from non-certified academic influences, including Dr. Ronald Givens, the state had decided that Chantel's refusal to cooperate with national agencies had put her child at risk. Now they were using it to justify taking him. There were no late-night arrests, no screaming headlines, just a quiet push through a side door of the legal system. A judge had been assigned, a white man, with a track record of siding with state agencies in custody disputes involving educational instability. His name raised red flags for Stone's legal team, almost immediately. Worse, they uncovered his past connection to one of the two agents who had threatened Chantel. Both had served on the same cybersecurity ethics panel a decade earlier. The connection wasn't illegal, but it was enough to poison the well. The proceedings were fast-tracked. No extended deliberations, no investigations into the legitimacy of the state's claims. The judge deemed the matter urgent, citing Malik's high-profile visibility and potential international interest. The implication was subtle but deadly. The boy wasn't just a student, he was an asset, and assets, when unsupervised, posed risks. Chantel's rage crystallized into clarity. This was no longer about Malik's well-being. It was about control. Of him, his intellect, his potential to disrupt. The court wasn't a place for justice anymore. It was a stage, and the actors had already been cast. She fought back hard. Stone offered resources. She declined the corporate legal team, and instead contacted a civil rights group with deep experience in cases involving state overreach and racialized custody manipulation. Within hours, a team of lawyers began building a counteroffensive. They combed through Malik's educational history, therapy reports, psychological evaluations, and academic accolades. They built a profile not of a boy under pressure, but of a child thriving under maternal protection. They reframed Givens not as a rogue influence, but as a documented academic with verifiable credentials and decades of published research. But the most critical move was Chantel's decision to take the case public. It wasn't an easy choice. She knew the risk, knew that opening the door to the media would mean renewed exposure, another round of threats, more headlines, more scrutiny, but she also knew silence was suffocating them. The court was stacked. The agencies had resources, connections, language. All she had left was truth, and its ability to burn through the lies. The press release was subtle, not desperate. It included documentation. It referenced the quiet targeting of Malik, the surveillance, the agents, the encryption breach, the custody threat. It avoided dramatics and stuck to facts. Within 24 hours, the story had exploded. News anchors began digging. Independent journalists uncovered documents linking the judge's prior rulings to controversial removals of children from low-income black families. Talk shows that had once dismissed Malik now invited legal experts to explain the unprecedented nature of his case. But the most devastating blow came from Malik himself. Unknown to Chantel, he had reached out to an underground media collective that specialized in whistleblower narratives. He had asked for anonymity. They had honored it, distorting his voice, shadowing his face, but his words needed no disguise. In the 15-minute interview, he laid it all bare. He spoke about being pulled from his mother, about being questioned without her, about the pressure to comply. He described the agents, the offer, the threat. He explained what it felt like to be treated not as a child, but as a system, a thing. But what changed everything was the closing line. He spoke softly, slowly, but with the gravity of someone who had just dropped a live wire into the room. He said he believed his father was still alive. Not a theory, not a wish. A belief based on something he had seen. A letter, not addressed to him, but about him, delivered weeks earlier in a plain envelope with no return address, containing only one thing: a folded page from an old notebook, bearing a proof Malik hadn't shared with anyone, except one person. Dr. Givens had seen the proof. So had Stone. But the handwriting on the note wasn't theirs. It matched neither of them. It matched something else. A piece of an old journal Malik had found buried in Stone's records. A page written by Darius Cross, a coder from over a decade ago. Malik had studied the loops, the way certain numbers were curved, the way formulas danced across the margin. He didn't say it aloud at the time. He had only stared. Now he said it on record. The handwriting was identical. The interviewer leaned forward, stunned. Malik said nothing else, but the message was clear. His father hadn't vanished. He'd been watching. The video went viral within hours. Not just for the revelations, but for the weight of Malik's voice. The emotion, the quiet heartbreak laced with resilience, the fear dressed as maturity, the kind of maturity no child should have to carry. The government agencies involved scrambled to respond. They released hollow statements, claimed confidentiality, denied coercion. The court case, once barreling toward a custody decision, slammed into a wall of public outrage. A federal injunction was filed by the civil rights team within 48 hours. Emergency motion, violation of constitutional rights, racial targeting, abuse of procedural fast-tracking. The judge, once confident and unbothered, was now under fire. His previous rulings were unearthed. Petitioners flooded the courthouse. The injunction was granted. Barely. It didn't end the case, but it froze it. Custody remained with Chantel, for now. The state retreated, cloaking its retreat in silence. The agents didn't return. The court date was postponed indefinitely. Chantel exhaled for the first time in weeks, but she knew it was temporary. The system had tried to erase her. It would try again.
Malik knew too.
He didn't celebrate the injunction. He simply returned to his notebooks. But this time, he didn't solve equations in isolation. He began looking backward. Through the data. Through the paper trail. Through the fragments of identity the world had tried to erase. He started building a profile. Not of himself, of his father. Names. Projects. Digital traces. Technical echoes. A language hidden not in documents, but in patterns. Because if Darius Cross was alive, and he had written that letter, then the next move wasn't in a courtroom. It was in the code. The interview revealed that Malik's father was alive, and had been secretly watching his son's rise from afar. But where was he hiding, and why had he stayed away this long? The notebook arrived in a box wrapped in duct tape, and silence. No note, no return address. Just layers of time, worn leather, and the weight of a life buried in secrecy. Chantel stared at it for hours before placing it in Malik's hands. She didn't explain. She didn't have to. The moment Malik opened the first page, he understood. His father had written this. Not for the world. For him. The paper was yellowed, corners curled, the ink had faded in places, as if the thoughts had tried to escape before being trapped in permanent. But the content, dense, sprawling, terrifyingly intricate, remained alive. Cryptic symbols, stacked formulas, scribbled riddles in margins, mathematical poetry woven through paranoia. There were sections scratched out violently, lines connecting one theory to another, followed by question marks and warnings. Words like decoy key, recursive fail point, and time delay structure floated beside half-drawn grids. Nothing made sense, and yet everything called to Malik. He didn't eat that night, didn't speak. He just read, and reread, then began decoding. By the third day, Malik had filled 3 notebooks of his own. Every page from his father's journal seemed to contain a cipher beneath the surface formula. A second language, layered into the math, that responded only to recursive interpretation. Dr. Givens reviewed a few samples remotely. His silence afterwards said everything. He recognized the brilliance. He also recognized the danger. The formulas weren't just theoretical. They were alive. Some of the riddles hinted at digital frameworks Malik had only seen in declassified documents. Others referenced algorithms, supposedly buried after whistleblowers leaked their potential misuse. The deeper Malik went, the clearer it became. Darius Cross hadn't disappeared. He had been erased, and now, his legacy threatened to resurface through his son. Malik built code around the sequences, testing the theories. One sequence, when converted, unraveled a compressed logic tree designed to mimic adaptive neural networks. Another opened what appeared to be an encryption shell. But instead of securing data, it inverted logic strings to create false pathways, rendering tracking systems useless. It was defense disguised as misdirection. Cloaking software before cloaking software had a name. Late one night, while Malik pored over the section labeled Fragment 27, he noticed something that froze him mid-scribble. The pattern he decoded wasn't new. It was almost identical to a dormant algorithm he'd seen recently, inside a research paper distributed by a major tech conglomerate. An algorithm that was supposedly decommissioned after being flagged by international ethics boards. It hadn't been decommissioned. It had been reactivated, and his father had designed its precursor, buried deep in the margins of a notebook no one was ever supposed to see again. Malik tried to dismiss the coincidence, but the data didn't lie. When he tested the pattern against open-source software samples, he saw it. The dormant algorithm was no longer dormant. A patch inside the tech company's latest firmware release had included lines of logic that mirrored Darius's recursive loops. Someone had dusted off his father's work, and now they were using it again. He tried to reach Dr. Givens. The call didn't go through. Tried again. Nothing. Tried to message Nia. Failed. Checked his own IP logs. Static. The encryption network Stone had set up for him, supposedly untraceable, was no longer behaving normally. Something was tracking him. The realization hit slowly, then all at once. It wasn't just academic curiosity that made the notebook dangerous. It was evidence. Proof of intellectual theft, of suppression, of a black genius turned into a scapegoat, whose discoveries had been stolen, monetized, and rewritten under someone else's name. And now that evidence lived in Malik's hand. Chantel noticed the shift in her son. He stopped sleeping, stopped smiling. His walls filled with diagrams, not of mathematical systems, but of trails, breadcrumbs, theories connecting his father's disappearance to whistleblower blackouts. He stopped talking about the future and began referencing events in past tense, as if something inside him already knew what was coming. One night she found him sitting alone, staring at a page with a half-written equation. The journal beside him lay open to a torn section marked only by one sentence in Darius' handwriting. If they find this, they will bury it again. They always do. Chantel finally opened her mouth to speak, to beg him to stop, to let it go, to breathe. But before she could say anything, Malik turned the page and stared. Then he ran to his computer, logged in, typed rapidly, opened a program Stone's engineers had buried behind 4 layers of firewalls. A real-time traffic monitoring system meant to detect malicious pings across the Institute's closed network. The results lit up instantly.
His IP had been flagged 17 times in the past hour.
All from one source, a tech company based in New York. The same company that had reactivated his father's algorithm. They weren't just watching, they were hunting. Stone was alerted immediately. His security team went into full lockdown. Firewalls reinforced, communications blacked out, all incoming traffic rerouted. Malik was escorted from the lab to a secure underground room, windowless, surrounded by insulated concrete, and stripped of any internet access. The notebook went with him. But even there, in that silence, the truth echoed louder than ever. He wasn't alone. They had always been watching. They had watched his father. Now they were watching him. Because Malik hadn't just inherited a gift. He had inherited a threat, a body of work so dangerous, so disruptive, so undeniably brilliant, that the systems built to elevate intelligence had chosen instead to erase it. Dr. Givens resurfaced 3 days later through a hidden satellite link. He'd gone off-grid after a breach attempt at his location. He'd survived because he had predicted the pattern of attack. He had known they'd come, not just for Malik, but for anyone connected to the notebook. He confirmed what Malik feared. The algorithm Darius had hidden was a backdoor, not into devices, into decisions. It mimicked human logic, adapted faster than machine learning. It could predict human behavior within systems. Not only that, it could suggest alternative outcomes, paths, reactions. It wasn't just software, it was synthetic intuition. And now, the world's most powerful company had reactivated it without understanding what it could really do. Or worse, understanding exactly what it could do. Malik asked Givens the only question that mattered. Why had his father written it in the first place? Givens didn't answer directly. He just said Darius had once dreamed of building something that could protect black life in real time. An algorithm that could anticipate racial bias in police responses, educational tracking, judicial rulings, something that could run in the background and correct injustice before it unfolded. That dream, they said, was the reason he was silenced. And now that dream lived again. But the nightmare chasing it had never left. Malik stared at the last page of the journal, a blank page. Except it wasn't blank. It was heat-sensitive. He held his hand over it, and slowly, a code began to appear. Coordinates, encrypted. Then a single word beneath them. Legacy. One equation matched a dormant algorithm, recently reactivated in a major tech company, and now they were tracking Malik's IP. But the final page of the journal just revealed encrypted coordinates, and one word, legacy. The coordinates from Darius's journal led Malik, not to a place, but to a digital archive, buried behind layers of decommissioned military code. An encrypted netspace, originally built by a government contractor in the early wave of predictive policing initiatives. The moment Malik broke through the second firewall, he knew he was trespassing. The system tried to ping him. He let it. He needed someone to notice, needed them to know that someone who understood the code had returned. What he found on the other side confirmed the unspoken fear Givens had carried for years. Darius's algorithm, the one buried in notebook pages and heat-sensitive ink, had not only survived, it had evolved. The entity now housing it was NVX, a sleek, ruthless tech corporation operating from a steel and glass fortress in Palo Alto. Officially, NVX branded itself as a predictive autonomy firm, specializing in AI logic for logistics, transportation, and threat detection. But Malik traced the fingerprint of his father's work in their engine's core architecture: recursive folds, mirror loops, and anti-bias tripwires, subtly disabled. NVX was using Darius's code to train a military-grade AI system. And they weren't using it to prevent harm. They were using it to target faster. The realization didn't spark rage in Malik. It sparked purpose. He knew he couldn't fight this alone. He reached out to Givens, who activated a dormant contact. Someone who once worked in NVX's innovation lab before disappearing from public view after a failed ethics suit. A whistleblower. Their name was never used. Their voice was disguised, but what they shared left no room for interpretation. Darius Cross had developed a model under contract with Stone's former co-founders. A collaborative algorithm designed to predict human behavior in high-stress scenarios. The idea was noble, but once the datasets shifted, the project took a darker turn. Racial bias, embedded subtly into every layer. When Darius protested, the project heads claimed the bias was statistical realism. When he pushed back harder, they framed him for data theft. His credentials were revoked, his name blacklisted. The code, now sanitized of Darius's name, was rebranded as proprietary innovation and licensed through shell firms until it quietly re-emerged under NVX's new umbrella. The deeper Malik dug, the clearer the trail became. A mosaic of betrayal, corporate whitewashing, and weaponized intellect. And now, with Malik replicating the same architecture, history was trying to bury it again. But Malik had something they didn't expect: his father's journal, and a mind that could outthink the system built to erase him. He began reconstructing the stolen algorithm, not to replicate it, but to expose it. He layered annotations proving it was authored years before NVX's patents, timestamps, signatures, source logic. Then he cross-referenced it with metadata from a data leak that surfaced during a past lawsuit NVX had quietly settled out of court. The pattern was undeniable. Darius had not only been the architect, he had been the silenced visionary. But the work wasn't without consequence. One night, just past 2:11 a.m., Chantel awoke to the sound of glass. The apartment's back door had been shattered. By the time she reached the hallway, the intruders were already gone. Malik's laptop was missing. Panic bled through her voice as she called Stone's security team. The building's exterior cameras had been cut just minutes before the break-in. Whoever had entered knew exactly where the vulnerabilities were. But Malik wasn't panicked. He was furious. He had encrypted the device with a recursive logic trap, one based on Darius's own encryption failsafe. The moment the intruder attempted to copy, decrypt, or run any code from the machine, the system would activate a loop of misinformation, injecting false data into every request, rendering the copied files useless, and corrupting the breach log. It wasn't a trap for recovery. It was bait. Within an hour, a return ping came from a server registered to a defense subcontractor affiliated with NVX's foreign operations arm. The same arm previously flagged for violations in Eastern Europe involving surveillance AI. They had taken the bait, and now Malik knew where they were. But then the unexpected twist arrived. Chantel's phone buzzed. No number, just a message, plain text. Your father's code will be wiped. You have 48 hours. Malik froze when he saw it. It wasn't just a threat. It was an ultimatum. Somewhere inside NVX's system, someone was preparing to erase the last remnant of Darius's work. Not the copies, not the archives, the root code. The raw original model buried in a hidden node. Darius had likely left as a failsafe in case something went wrong. A model Malik had just discovered days ago, but hadn't had time to clone. If that core was destroyed, the legal proof of authorship would vanish with it. His father would disappear again. This time for good. He told Chantel the truth. She didn't blink. She simply said they wouldn't let it happen. They contacted the whistleblower again, asked where the root node might be stored. The voice on the other end hesitated, then answered with a cryptic phrase. Legacy doesn't live in the code. It lives in the conflict. Malik understood. The root wasn't stored digitally. It was embedded inside a logic flaw intentionally written into NVAX's active system. A Trojan signature Darius had left behind, cloaked in mathematical noise. It only surfaced under one condition, when someone attempted to delete the system's ethical override sequence. In other words, they couldn't erase him without triggering the truth. Malik had 48 hours to activate that sequence. He opened his console, typed in the base layer code, initiated the retrieval. Stone's legal team prepared to act if the proof emerged. They could move with injunctions, lawsuits, exposure. But it would all depend on Malik getting in, extracting the proof, and getting out before NVX scrambled the system. What none of them expected was what came next. As Malik began decoding the logic path, a new screen flashed. It wasn't part of his code. It wasn't a system response. It was a live feed, a surveillance cam, somewhere dimly lit. A cell. A man sitting at a desk, back to the camera. Then he turned, and Malik stopped breathing. The image flickered, but the face, it was Darius. Older, thinner, beard streaked with gray, alive, not free, being watched, monitored. And behind him, on the wall was a logo. NVX. Malik received a text on an untraceable phone. Your father's code will be wiped. You have 48 hours. But as he initiated the retrieval, a surveillance feed opened, revealing his father, alive, imprisoned inside an NVX facility. The countdown began the moment the surveillance feed closed. Malik didn't speak. Neither did Chantel. They simply looked at each other, and in that silent exchange, every unspoken fear became a mission. Darius wasn't gone. He was alive, not lost. Hell, and now the very company that stole his work was preparing to wipe him from history completely. Victor Stone cleared space in his private foundation's underground server facility. Thick steel doors sealed behind them. Only retinal scan and biometric data allowed access. There would be no distractions, no exits, no sleep until every thread of Darius Cross's legacy was copied, encrypted, and made undeniable. Dr. Givens arrived by encrypted transport, the first time he'd emerged in person since going underground. His face bore exhaustion, but his eyes lit up when he saw the journal, now cracked open and glowing under lab lights. He didn't ask how it had arrived. He didn't ask why the floor plans of NVX's internal lab showed a detention wing. He simply began typing. There were 48 hours before the deletion window closed. 48 hours to archive and prove authorship, to transfer metadata, to clone the embedded logic keys, to cross-reference timestamps, to turn a handwritten journal into a bulletproof case. The lab became a war room. Chantel ran logistics. Givens focused on parsing the mathematical sequences for the legal team. Malik relentless streamed his own process, not to an audience, but to posterity. Every keystroke, every line of code, every annotation, he narrated as he built, explaining how each recursive path mirrored his father's original logic, not for recognition, for proof. This time, the world would see. They wouldn't have to believe him. The math would speak louder than anything. NVX responded within hours. Their lawyers filed a digital injunction, accusing Malik and his team of intellectual property theft, algorithm tampering, and unauthorized access of proprietary systems. The language was brutal, laced with corporate jargon and veiled threats. They demanded a cease and desist, threatened to freeze Stone's assets, and warned that continued exploitation of classified architectures may constitute a federal offense. But it was too late for silence. The internet had already taken hold. After Malik posted a 5-minute live stream showing the original notebook against the mirror structure of NVX's code, the clip exploded. Over 10 million views in 24 hours. Tech blogs picked it up, then academic journals, then news anchors. The headlines spread like a crack across glass. Black teen exposes corporate theft of father's AI code, proves legacy was stolen. NVX pushed back hard. They accused Malik of manipulating public sentiment. They cited security concerns, but their refusal to answer direct questions only fueled suspicion. The silence from federal agencies, especially those previously invested in Malik's recruitment, became deafening. Meanwhile, civil rights organizations mobilized, not just because of the code, because of the pattern. Another black mind erased, another corporate entity absorbing brilliance without credit. They demanded an investigation, not just into NVX but into every decision that led to Darius Cross being imprisoned, forgotten, and replaced. Chantel watched all of it unfold, torn between hope and dread. Malik didn't stop. With Stone's team, he began creating a blockchain archive of the journal, cross-verified by 3 independent academics, all of them black, all of them pushed out of mainstream institutions in the last 2 decades. The goal wasn't just to save Darius's work. It was to make it unerasable. Every page was scanned, documented, referenced and mirrored across servers in 5 countries. It wasn't just code anymore. It was a historical artifact, and the world knew it. Then came the twist. No one predicted. Out of nowhere, a federal judge, previously uninvolved in the custody battle, or the injunction, unsealed a buried document from Darius's original criminal case. No press announcement, no warning, just an internal filing made public through a forgotten portal that journalists stumbled across while researching the scandal. The document was a deposition, over a decade old, signed by a systems engineer who had worked on the original code with Darius before his arrest. The engineer had died years ago, in what was labeled a traffic incident. But before his death, he had left a sealed testimony with the Department of Justice. Inside it, he confessed he had participated in falsifying code logs under direction from NVX executives. They'd told him it was standard cleanup, that Darius had disappeared, and the code needed to be secured. But when he realized the logs had been altered before Darius's arrest, he began asking questions. That's when the threats began. The testimony was detailed. Dates, file names, executives' initials, backup server locations, and one final paragraph. Darius Cross didn't steal anything. He built everything. They were afraid of what it could do in black hands. They wanted control, so they broke the man who created it. The internet broke open again. Journalists dug deeper. Independent programmers verified every part of the engineer's story. A retired prosecutor anonymously confirmed that the deposition had been sealed under pressure from external partners. Suddenly, Malik's case wasn't just about intellectual property. It was about conspiracy. And Darius's name wasn't just rising from obscurity. It was rising from the dead. Givens leaned against a server rack, shaking his head as the story unfolded across multiple screens. He had fought for years to prove his own work hadn't been AI-generated. He had lost tenure over questions of authorship, all because, like Darius, he had dared to be original and black. Now, with the engineer's confession unsealed, the world couldn't look away. But it wasn't over. The 48-hour clock was still ticking. Chantel's hands trembled as she checked the data transfer logs. Everything was moving on schedule, until she noticed one anomaly: a packet of corrupted files from Darius's earliest sequences. They had been infected by a malware signature. NVX had injected false code into the archive through the stolen laptop weeks ago. If Malik hadn't encrypted the files, it would have worked. The corrupted files were tagged to self-replicate during transfer, burying Darius's logic under noise and invalidating the authorship trail. Malik ran a diagnostic and caught it with seconds to spare. He initiated a hard clean, deleted the malware chain, rebuilt the affected pages using the scans from the original journal. Stone's lead technologist watched the process and whispered the obvious. They were willing to burn the truth just to stay in power. The thought chilled Chantel to the bone. These weren't just threats anymore. This was war. And her son was fighting it with nothing but brilliance, proof, and a name they had tried to erase. When the final archive was complete, Malik stood in front of the screen, drained, pale, shaking, and uploaded it to the public mirror, a decentralized archive, immutable, protected, verified, alive. He stared at the progress bar, watched it hit, and let go. The world had it now. No court could bury it. No company could silence it. No government could pretend it didn't exist. But as he turned to leave the lab, his encrypted phone vibrated. Just once. A single message, coordinates, a timestamp, and 3 words. He's still here. Then, out of nowhere, a federal judge unsealed a court document from Darius's case, one that had been suppressed for over a decade. Inside was a confession from a now-dead engineer, and Malik just received coordinates that may lead to the impossible: finding his father alive. Years had passed since the courtroom verdict, though the impact of what had happened seemed as vivid as if it were yesterday. The whitewashed walls of institutions that once ignored him now bore the name of Malik Briggs, etched into plaques, displayed in lecture halls, remembered in academic footnotes. He was no longer simply the kid from Georgia who solved the Meissner grid. He had become a symbol of what happens when the world underestimates a black mind, and then pays for that mistake. The brilliance Malik demonstrated did more than solve a puzzle. It dismantled entire architectures of omission and suppression. The tech corporations, the academic institutions, the federal agencies that had once treated him as a liability now quietly shifted their practices, as if recognizing him forced them to recognize themselves. It was subtle: new scholarship funds, revised vetting policies, open data initiatives, but valid. Change was not roaring, it was seeping. Meanwhile, his mother, Chantel Briggs, transformed. The diner waitress, whose customer once smirked and told her to stay in your place, stood on stages with podiums and spotlighted microphones. Her voice carried not anger alone, but armor forged from years of fight. She told audiences of that moment how a simple insult lit a fire inside her that burned brighter than any doubter's dismissal. She urged parents and children alike, when someone tells you your place, don't accept the map they give you. Draw your own. Chantel's talks became national. She spoke in school auditoriums, community centers, and now at universities. Her story was no longer just about a mother nurturing a prodigy. It was about how racism and intelligence intersected, how the system feared what it couldn't box, and how one family reshaped that system from the inside. She never framed it as victimhood. She called it reclamation. And then there was Darius Cross, Malik's father, once erased, once designated a criminal, once silenced. His exoneration had opened prisons for the truth. But for Darius, the real freedom came when he stepped into the lab at Stone's Institute as a mentor. The institute that once ignored his brilliance now sought his guidance. He stood in rooms full of students, many of them young black women and men who saw themselves in him, who saw possibility in him, who believed because his story proved they could. He didn't lecture in jargon. He talked about logic as justice, code as voice, patterns as possibility. And then there was Dr. Ronald Givens, the mathematician who had withdrawn from the world years before. Disillusioned by racial sabotage in academia, he returned to the public eye, carried from the shadows into invited lectures, keynote talks, and collaborative projects. But what mattered most wasn't his return. It was how his return validated Malik, Darius, and Chantel. In many ways, Givens' revival mimicked Malik's, not as mimicry, but as proof that the system which forced both out could be forced to let them back in.
Malik himself?
He vanished from the limelight quietly. No fanfare, no red carpet. He walked away from public engagements after the initial years of advocacy. Some speculated it was burnout. Others said he chose the invisible path because he wanted to think, not be seen. He retreated to a secluded wing of the institute, working on a new problem no one else knew about. But that silence carried weight. It was a signal. The brightest minds sometimes move in shadows so their light doesn't get distorted by the glare. Yet the legacy was not personal. It was collective. Every time a black child walked through the doors of the newly funded STEM centers, branded under Darius Cross's name, the world shifted a little. In Chicago, Detroit, Atlanta, Milwaukee, hubs opened in neighborhoods historically excluded from tech pipelines. The name on the building mattered, not because Darius was famous, because he survived being erased, because his story told them it was possible. One of the unexpected twists in the years that followed was the way the stolen algorithm, once a corporate asset, became an open-source template for community innovation. The logic loops Darius built, Malik refined, scholars extended, local startups used those ideas to create grassroots solutions, predictive tools for urban farms, adaptive learning systems for after-school programs, equity-based algorithms for resource allocation in underserved schools. What had been weaponized for control was repurposed for empowerment. In a modest lab in the Atlanta STEM Center, a whiteboard bore Malik's old comment, "Patterns care nothing for color, but people do." It hung slightly askew, as if proving authenticity. A young girl, 7 years old, stood before it. Her name was Aaliyah Reed. She drew primes and loops, rewrote Malik's proof in crayon and marker. She was black. She was gifted. She was exactly the kind of person the system used to tell to stay in her place. And now she refused. The institutes quietly celebrated representation. The wider world debated pipeline disparities and systemic bias. But each of those children, each of those centers, shifted the odds. The pattern Malik and his father cracked wasn't just mathematical. It was cultural. It signaled possibility. Chantel watched from the front row as Aaliyah sketched circles and arrows, kinetic joy in her posture, and recognition in her eyes. She thought back to every coffee-stained shift, every sneer, every test where Malik was told he was disruptive rather than gifted. She thought of the first student who told Malik he couldn't be smart because of his zip code. None of that mattered anymore, because here in this room, the expectation had changed. The legacy had only just begun. In a small room in Atlanta, a 7-year-old girl stared at a whiteboard, solving the next impossible puzzle. And somewhere in the lab, Malik watched quietly, ready to pass the torch, but he wasn't who you thought he'd become. No child should be punished for brilliance, and no family should fight alone just to be seen. If this story made you feel something, if it reminded you how deep injustice can go, type yes. If you believe in justice, subscribe if this broke your heart. The courtroom felt colder than any server room Malik had ever entered. But this time, the tension wasn't digital. It was historical, buried in walls, in eyes, in decades of denial. And now the truth was finally going to speak, not through algorithms or code, but from a wooden bench beneath an oath. The Briggs family's lawsuit against NVX, and the federal agency that oversaw Darius Cross's conviction, had become the most anticipated civil rights trial in years. Reporters called it the algorithm reckoning. Civil rights leaders called it overdue. Silicon Valley executives called it dangerous. Whatever the title, the stakes were clear. This was no longer about stolen code. It was about stolen futures. Victor Stone covered the legal expenses. Given served as an expert witness. Chantel, once branded a waitress with delusions, sat in the front row, no longer just a mother, but a symbol of maternal defiance in the face of institutional theft. She wore all white. Malik, now 17, walked into the courtroom not as a victim, but as the mind that forced an empire to admit what it tried to bury. The gallery was packed. Black engineers in tailored suits, professors in faded academic regalia, journalists scribbling furiously. Cameras weren't allowed, but the world watched through every word printed, every headline updated in real time. The government, cornered by years of suppressed documents, attempted to deflect. Their lawyers called the case an unfortunate series of misunderstandings. They claimed Darius had been treated fairly by the standards of the time, but their defense crumbled when Exhibit A was submitted into record. The scanned page from the now deceased engineer confessing to data fabrication and direct orders from NVX executives. And when Malik was called to the stand, the room changed. He sat straight, calm, measured. The prosecutor asked him to explain the algorithm. He didn't use jargon. He told a story. He spoke of patterns, of predictions, of systems that learned from history, and either replicated its violence or corrected its course. He explained his father's goal, to build an AI system that protected, not punished, that warned before bias became brutality, that gave voice to the silenced through mathematics. He walked the jury through the recursive loops, but more importantly, he showed them the trail dates, notebooks, diagrams, proof that what NVX now called proprietary was born years before their founding. In the hands of a black man, they chose to disappear. But what silenced the room was Malik's closing statement. He described the night he saw his father on the surveillance feed. Not with anger, not with bitterness, but with quiet devastation. They took his body, he said, and then they tried to take his mind. But they forgot we don't die in silence. We multiply. The room held its breath. Then came the unexpected blow. Under oath, a retired federal agent took the stand and admitted he had been ordered to suppress evidence during Darius's trial. He confessed that internal pressure had come from both political and corporate forces, that once NVX realized Darius's model would prevent the kind of predictive policing they wanted to sell, they made him a liability. The courtroom cracked open. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours. Their verdict: full exoneration of Darius Cross. Public acknowledgement of wrongful conviction. $42 million in restitution, split between damages to Darius's estate, Chantel for the unlawful custody proceedings, and Malik for intellectual theft. Applause wasn't permitted, but when the judge adjourned, the gallery stood in silence, a defiant, wordless ovation. Chantel exhaled, finally. Tears rolled quietly down her face, not out of victory, but exhaustion. For years she had fought the lie. Now truth had finally been made law. But then came the twist. Malik declined the award. He wouldn't accept the money, not for himself, not as a payout for pain. Instead, he stood before the court and made a statement that would be printed on the front page of every major outlet by morning. He demanded that the financial restitution be redirected, fully, publicly, and irrevocably, into a nationwide STEM foundation dedicated exclusively to Black youth, not just in honor of his father, but in his name. The Darius Cross Legacy Initiative. One condition: each center must be independently operated, publicly audited, and built in communities historically excluded from STEM education. And one more demand: every child accepted into the program would be told the full story. Not just about the math, but the injustice, the theft, the fight, so they would know the truth before they were taught to doubt their worth. The courtroom erupted, not in chaos, in change. In the hours that followed, headlines didn't just speak of victory. They spoke of redirection. NVIAC's stock plummeted. Tech leaders scrambled to issue apologies. College deans sent invitations to Malik, which he ignored. He had already chosen his next project, but Malik didn't linger in the spotlight. He disappeared quietly, with Chantel, choosing privacy over praise. Yet the seed had been planted. Within weeks, applications poured in from students across the country. Engineers volunteered as mentors. Retired educators offered to teach. City leaders offered land. It became more than a program. It became a movement, a correction, a beginning. But while the world celebrated, one question remained. Where was Darius? The court confirmed his innocence. The world acknowledged his genius. But his body, his presence, was still missing. Until Malik opened the coordinates sent to his phone. A new location, encrypted, and a time, 24 hours. Malik demanded that the funds build a nationwide STEM network for Black youth, with Darius's name on every center. But as the centers broke ground, Malik opened a second message, a final location, a final chance to bring his father home.